Hello everyone, welcome to the first episode of Diz Fairs, where we're delving into Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. It's not pronounced dwarves, which might make you wonder, what? Well, when Snow White started production in 1935, there was no such word as dwarves. The plural version of the word didn't appear anywhere in literature until Tolkien released The Hobbit a year before Snow White released. Tolkien even elaborated that the true plural of dwarf is dwarfs, and he only uses the word dwarves as a distinction when speaking of Thorin Oakenshield's ancient people. Nonetheless, since about 1970, the word dwarves has increased in popularity, and even more so since the release of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy. But if you consider a red dwarf, and then think about two, do you think they're called red dwarfs or red dwarves? Just to clarify, the scientific name is dwarfs. Anyway, back to Snow White. The move for Walt to make a feature-length animation was an unpredictable move, and there's evidence that even if he was up to the task, he didn't really know what he was getting his studio into. Both Walt's wife and his brother Roy tried to talk him out of the project. Throughout all of Hollywood, the project of Snow White was known as Disney's Folly, which added a layer of stress that Walt, his brother Roy, and the Bank of America who was funding the project certainly didn't need. Although, Walt speaks of the tumultuous time quite differently.
I didn't know what I had or what would happen or anything. We had the family fortune. We had everything wrapped up in Snow White. In fact, the banker, I think, was losing more sleep than I was.
Virtually no one in Hollywood believed a full-length animated feature would work. And looking at the cartoons of the day, you can't blame them. Fun as it is, how long can people really be expected to sit through something like this? But this wasn't the sort of animation Walt had in mind. The short animations Disney was making at the time was a series called Silly Symphonies, which were a cut above the average animations of the day. The budget for each Silly Symphony was roughly the same, but Walt needed more money than he initially realized. His original budget called for $250,000, which was 10 times larger than the average Silly Symphony. Seeing as how the film was supposed to be 10 times longer than a Silly Symphony, you can see how he got to that figure. The feature ended up costing $1.5 million, 6 times as much money. Walt even had to mortgage his home to drudge up the final funds for the production, so it's hard to believe a wife who tried to talk him out of it, whose home is now mortgaged, and living beside his terrified brother whom he also worked with, yes, they had side-by-side homes at the time, to say Walt didn't feel any stress seems unlikely. Thankfully, Snow White became the highest-grossing film of 1938. Up to that point, the highest-grossing film ever. It made $8 million internationally. It was also fiscally clobbered by Gone with the Wind a year later. Although considering decades of theatrical releases, VHSs, DVDs, Blu-rays, Snow White has grossed $2.15 billion big ones, and is ranked number 11 in the highest-grossing films of all time, narrowly edging out Jurassic Park and Jaws. Take that, Spielberg!
See, nobody cares. Nice hat.
The first year of production on Snow White was brutal. So rough, in fact, that Walt shelved the project for most of the second year. The initial drafts he worked on all had this comical quality you pretty much see in Silly Symphonies. What really turned the corner for both Disney and American animation was the Evil Queen. The decision to make a real, terrifying villain opened an entire new avenue never before explored. This, in turn, affected all of the other characters, the overall tone of the film. It added weight, plausibility, a sense of real danger, created real reactions. By 1936, the Disney studio was full steam into uncharted animation territory. They knew there would be pitfalls, they just didn't know exactly where the dangers lay, how treacherous they were, or even what tools they needed. Up until this time, animation in the United States had evolved into this rubbery squash and stretch style you see in Felix the Cat, Betty Boop, and what have you. To avoid this, Walt made the innovative decision to make Albert Herder the head of design. Now, if you've never heard of him, don't feel bad. Even people in the profession of animation would be hard-pressed to recollect his name. However, the Swiss immigrant was a very talented and creative artist, with a lean towards the dark and perhaps gruesome. He was hired on for Silly Symphonies, but the studio realized his work was better suited as what's known as an inspirational artist. Every day, his job was to just crank out creative sketches that were posted around the animation offices to get the minds of artists thinking differently, more creatively. So selecting an individual as Herder as head of design on Snow White was not a predictable move. However, it's not out of left field either. Walt wanted the design to have an authentic European feel, which Herder was, and Walt wanted a visually dark tone, which Herder innately possessed. Now, I haven't heard this explanation anywhere, but one of the reasons people of the time didn't believe a full-length animated feature would work was because the color would eventually hurt people's eyes. So it's fair to assume choosing a dark palette was one of the reasons Walt wanted a darker feature. He is known to have explicitly told his animators to use expressionist films, such as Nosferatu, as well as The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, as influences for Snow White. Unquestionably dark pictures. So Herder's European style, along with his gritty and realistic edge, really grounded the design. All animations begin with concept artwork and sketches. It's a stage for the artists to let their imaginations run wild, which happened to be Herder's strongest arena. One of his initial sketches for Snow White portrayed her in a glass coffin, surrounded by the sobbing dwarfs. This scene broke the premiere's audience to tears, the first time an audience ever did so with an animation, a feat many thought impossible, given that animated characters weren't real. Grumpy's endearing reaction to Snow White's kiss is also attributed to one of Herder's sketches. There's no doubt his ability to elicit emotional reactions propelled the art of animation into the future. Okay, so back to the Evil Queen. Early versions of the Evil Queen depicted her as a fat, baddie, sort of a walking pun. But the changes made to her and the script transformed her into the villain that still sparks an unsettling mood not often found in modern villains. It's theorized her physical design was inspired by Helen Gahagan, if I'm saying her name right, in a movie called She, which released in 1935, which is kinda sorta right during the pre-production time of Snow White. The Grimm's fairy tale Evil Queen's name is Grimhild, which is such a great name it's hard to understand why it wasn't used in Snow White. Unless you recall that the film was made in the midst of post-World War I anti-German hysteria era. The role of the Evil Queen, as well as her witch alter ego, went to Lucille Laverne after a single audition. An accomplished actress on both the stage and screen, she had been a child actress, had her own theater troupe that traveled through both the United States and Europe, and possessed an impressively long line of silent film credits. The studio was not looking to hire the same actress for The Witch and the Evil Queen, but Laverne was so fantastic the choice was made for them. According to the studio, she wasn't particularly sociable, but rather serious and professional. She came in, was very obliging to direction, did her lines, then was off on her way out the door. Gone. Didn't look back. Roughly 65 or so years old during recording, Laverne's secret to the witch's elderly voice was her simply taking out her teeth. Apparently, the line where she says, "Oh, my heart," was so believable that people actually ran to her side, believing she was suffering a heart attack. Her blood-curdling laugh was iconic, used many times throughout her career. This scream was also used for Maleficent's dying scream in Sleeping Beauty over 20 years later. The Evil Queen was Laverne's final role. She retired from acting in 1937, before the release of Snow White, and became a co-owner of a successful nightclub. Animators used a lot of Laverne's mannerisms and caricatured expressions for the film, as well as Don Brody, who dressed as a witch for the rotoscoping. You may not have heard of Don Brody, but he did tons of bit parts in TV and film over 50 years. If you were alive during his time, you're likely to recognize his face. Kinda like Christine Baranski, which you may not exactly know her name, but you're like, hey, I know her. There's no clear answer as to why Walt chose the story of Snow White for his first feature film. What is known is that in 1916, as a teenager, he watched the silent black and white Snow White film that had been adapted from the Broadway play Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. People like to say Walt came up with the idea of an animated version while watching it, but it seems far-fetched that a 15-year-old rail station snack seller in Kansas City would have such prolific foresight. However, the film obviously left an impression on him. So yeah, seeing as how no one had ever made a feature-length animation, Disney had to make all of the original mistakes and what not to do. Don't get me wrong, changes during production happen all the time in movies, but in animations, you really want to try to keep it down to a minimum. That being said, in Snow White, entire scenes were animated, only to be cut because of the changes being made to the script. Ward Kimball, one of Disney's 9 old men, nearly quit after 2 of his main sequences he animated were entirely scrapped. The song, as well as the animation for Music in Your Soup, was cut for 2 reasons. 1, because it didn't drive the story, and 2, because the sequence of events had been so altered, the scene no longer made any sense. On top of this, it took more time than you would think for Snow White to become the main character of the film. The scripts were just all over the place. However, many of the changes made proved to be quite innovative and are still practiced. Live animals were brought into the studio to be used as reference. Classes were offered for artists to hone their skills, a story in and of itself, but I'm clipping this short. To keep creativity alive, Walt came up with the idea of giving $5 to anyone whose gag made it into the film. To put it in perspective, minimum wage in 1938 was 25 cents an hour, so $5 was half a week's salary at minimum wage. An example of a gag Disney loves to use is Ward Kimball's suggestion of the dwarves' noses popping over the beds as they met Snow White. The dwarfs in Snow White were animated by a host of Disney greats, including Walt's 9 old men. But seeing as how we're eventually going to give each of these animators their own episode, let's just say, unlike most main characters in animations, none of the dwarfs were given their own personal animator. Rather, animators were given scenes, and sometimes a single lead animator would work on an entire scene, sometimes just part of a scene. From what I can gather, it was extremely muddled. But every frame of animation did have to pass the impervious gateway of Walt Disney's notoriously critical approval. Speaking of Walt and dwarfs, it was his idea to give them names. They weren't exactly individuals in the Grimm's fairy tale version, so Disney sifted through about 100 or so names. Suffice it to say that audiences got the best combination of 7. Grumpy was actually voiced by Pinto Colvig, which, if you don't know, was the original voice of Goofy and Pluto's Barks. Dopey was supposed to be voiced by Mel Blanc, but Walt decided the character was funnier if mute. I wonder if this was a reflection or reaction to Harpo Marx, who broke out with the Marx Brothers' Duck Soup about a year before Disney started production on Snow White. Internet sites and other YouTube videos claim Dopey has Angel Man syndrome, which affects speech and balance along with a smiling disposition. I debated whether or not to comment on this and ultimately decided I should. Because saying Dopey has Angel Man syndrome is just ignorant, and why not try to put a stop to that, right? Angel Man syndrome is a neurogenetic disorder. It's true that those with Angel Man syndrome often smile and suffer from speech problems, if they can speak at all. But that's where this glossed over explanation's connection to Dopey ends. Believing that having mobility and balance issues along with a smiling disposition is grounds for naming a character Dopey is just gross. Believing Disney named a disabled character Dopey with such a disorder is even more gross. And ignoring all of the troubles that go with having Angel Man syndrome while only focusing on the smiling disposition is offensive. I'm going to stop here. You get the point. Dopey doesn't have Angel Man syndrome, and now you know why. Okay, so on to Snow White herself. Her character was comprised of the virtues of the era. She is kind, optimistic, occasionally sassy, motheringly assertive, and dutiful. She also possesses empathetic flaws such as gullibility and being easily manipulated. Now, at this point in animation, animating realistic humans was a particularly hard nut that had yet to be cracked. Disney Studios tried to animate a realistic female character with Persephone in the silly symphony The Goddess of Spring, which was not so great. The closest thing to a successfully animated character was Betty Boop, and so Walt Disney hired Grim Natwick, the animator and designer of Betty Boop. After Disney hired Natwick, they had him animate Cookie Carnival, which was a vast improvement on Persephone. Thus, Grim Natwick became the lead animator on Snow White herself. It's true that real rouge was used on each cell to give Snow White her rosy cheeks. During that age, the ink and paint department was comprised entirely of women. Helen Auger, I should mention, added the blush. However, the department also felt Snow White's hair was too stark black, and so they also brushed wisps of light gray over her hair in each cell. Seeing as how the budget of Snow White was practically growing by the day, Disney decided to rotoscope Snow White, the evil queen, her counterpart witch, and the prince in order to cut on production time and save money. If you're not already familiar, rotoscoping is when you trace directly over live-action footage for animation. The decision to rotoscope infuriated the animation team, but they ultimately understood the situation, additionally because the dwarfs were still in their hands, so they could do as much squash and stretch as they pleased there. Realistic men, however, even with rotoscoping, still proved to be a rather stolid problem, which is one of the reasons the prince has so little screen time. Up to the storyboard phase, he had a much larger role in the film. He was captured by the evil queen, put in a dungeon, and had a daring escape. But yeah, Snow White's prince was cut to the bare essentials. He just kept coming out way too stiff, a problem Disney wouldn't fully tackle until animating a realistic male form in the production of Cinderella over a decade later. It may be surprising to learn that Snow White is supposed to be 14 years old. In the Disney version, in the Grimm's Fairy Tale version, 14. She doesn't at all look that way to us today. Maybe she did back then, I don't know. But the actress used for rotoscoping Snow White was in fact 14 years old at the time she was filmed. Her name was Marge Champion, just such a great name. Daughter to a Hollywood dance director who worked with many cinema stars. The name that pops out the most was that her father, among others I'm sure, instructed Shirley Temple in the art of the dance. Marge Champion was obviously taught by her father and was actually an instructor by the age of 12. After modeling the role of Snow White, she went on to model as the Blue Fairy in Pinocchio and Hyacinth Hippo in Fantasia. She eventually went on to have an impressive career on and off the stage and in film studios throughout her very long life. She passed in 2020 at the age of 101. Kind of a fun fact was that she married Art Babbitt, the art designer and animator of Goofy. They divorced after 3 years. The voice of Snow White fell upon Adriana Cassilotti. Essentially, Cassilotti was an 18-year-old making her way into the business with MGM as a singer and chorus girl when she found an in with Snow White. Walt Disney had actually called her father, who ran a studio for voice lessons, including operatic singers, which Adriana also was. She happened to overhear the conversation between her father and Walt and got herself an audition. The first audition for the part. And she did a great job. So much so that she beat out the subsequent 150 actresses that also tried for the part after her. Now, there's a lot of misinformation and rumors surrounding Cassilotti and the Disney Corporation, so let's try to straighten some of them out. First off, people say it's unfair that Cassilotti wasn't credited for her voice in the film, but voice actors and actresses at the time didn't get such credits in animations. And animated features were literally a new thing. So the rules, laws, protocol, etiquette we have today weren't laid out yet. So that's misleading. Second, it said that Disney put Adriana Cassilotti under contract so she couldn't act in the film industry ever again. However, she was an off-screen voice in The Wizard of Oz.
Wherefore art thou, Romeo?
And was a bar singer in It's a Wonderful Life. So this just wasn't true. Thirdly, Adriana was hired during many re-releases of the film for promotional work. Her voice was also re-recorded for I'm Wishing in 1983, so it doesn't appear she held an egregious grudge against the company as is so often offhandedly mentioned. Fourthly, she proceeded to have a career on stage as an opera singer, so she wasn't a destitute actress always seeking work for the rest of her days. As far as I can tell, Adriana Cassilotti was a talented woman who had an amazing life. The biggest breakthrough innovation in Snow White was the multiplane camera. The machine is essentially a process which moves different layers of animation or background at different speeds past a camera to generate a sense of depth. The technique pulls you into a scene. I had a job as a web animator in the early 2000s and implemented the technique, and the company called in like the entire staff of 50 people into a boardroom to see it, as if this was something new and not a 70-year-old animation trick. It's just not utilized as it should be in modern animation, and that includes 3D. Disney Studios didn't design the multiplane system, nor were they the first to use it, but they created the most sophisticated version, utilizing up to 7 layers with a movable camera. This multiplane system was used up until The Little Mermaid when computers started making such effects easier, not to mention all of the doors opened by the evolution of digital effects. Now, every animation project Walt Disney worked on pushed the limits of technology as well as art. It's as though each film or short was essentially a test run for some future project. The multiplane system was first tested in the Old Mill, which was an Academy Award-winning silly symphony, before being used in Snow White, which went on to raise the bar of animation across the globe. It's also worth mentioning that Disney released Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in Technicolor, which isn't too surprising given Disney's history with Technicolor. Walt had negotiated an exclusive contract, so his company would be the only studio able to use 3-color Technicolor in animations for several years until 1935. Other studios had to use 2-color Technicolor. However, by the time Snow White came around, there was a new successive exposure Technicolor, which is a 3-strip process designed mostly for animations. Not to get too technical, but the color of Snow White for the time was astounding, and the financial success of Snow White seriously helped Technicolor, which was struggling to gain traction in Hollywood, finally getting their foot in the door with other studios. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, among all of the other firsts previously mentioned, was also the first film to have the very first purchasable soundtrack. 25 songs were composed for Snow White, yet only 7 were used. The song Music in Your Soup was cut from the movie and soundtrack, but you can hear it pretty much anywhere. On the additional footage with the purchase of the film, or you can hear it online, or on YouTube, you're already here, or on the queue for the mine train ride at the Magic Kingdom. I'm not sure if it's played at the mine train in Shanghai, but it's likely. Okay, so Hi Ho, Someday My Prince Will Come, and Whistle While You Work were composed by Frank Churchill and Larry Morey. The two eventually worked with Disney on other successful projects, but their strongest and most noteworthy works, arguably, were in Snow White. And yeah, Snow White was also the first movie to have merchandise and toys sold at the time of the premiere, setting the stage for McDonald's Happy Meal prizes in the decades to follow. If you're into hidden Mickeys, I only learned of 3 in the film. Here, and here. So, because of the success of the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Walt was able to construct a new animation studio in Burbank, still in operation today. It generated enough income to cover many future projects, pay off all debts, influenced an entirely new era of animation. Lillian Disney was able to pay off that mortgage, I'm sure, and turned Walt Disney and his studio into a powerful force in Hollywood. It was a breaking floodgate of imagination and design that's still gushing into the 21st century. So yeah, it may have all started with a mouse, but it apparently needed 7 dwarfs with shovels and pickaxes to break through a particularly onerous wall of success. Well, that wraps up this episode. I had fun. I hope you had fun. Learned some Disney stuff. Hit the like if you liked. You know the bit. Hopefully this inspires you to watch a classic. It's totally worth your time. Diz Fairs out.